A pedigree is like a family tree. So in this family tree, you have the members of the family, and through this family tree, what you can do is trace a particular trait. Let's say the trait that you choose to trace is curly hair. Now, this person has curly hair. You can follow the family tree, and then you can see that this person also has curly hair. So in two separate generations, you were able to find which members had curly hair or which members possessed the trait. And by tracing the direction of the trait, you are also able to identify how exactly is the genetic information from here transmitted here, or the mode of inheritance. So the family tree is used for two stuffs. Number one, to trace the trait through generations in family tree, and number two, to determine the mode of inheritance. And this is exactly what we are going to do in this particular video. But first, let's look at the basics of pedigree. So in a pedigree, a circle means a female and a square means a male. This is a marriage line, and these are the children. The children are arranged in order of birth from left to right. That means this would be the oldest child and this would be the youngest child. The generations are shown using Roman numericals. So this is one generation and this is the other generation. If the shape is shaded, that means the person possesses this trait or is affected by the trait. But if the shape is not shaded, that means the person does not possess the trait or is not affected by the trait. If the shape is half shaded, that means the person is a carrier. And a carrier is possible only when we are tracing a recessive trait. Remember, carrier is possible only in case of a recessive trait. How? You will come to know soon enough. So let's look at the various modes of inheritance. There are altogether 6 modes of inheritance that you need to know. Autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, X-linked recessive, Y-linked and mitochondrial. Out of these 6, the last two, Y-linked and mitochondrial, are really easy to identify. These 4 are the ones for which I am going to give you the respective tricks to identify them whenever a pedigree is given to you. So you have a pedigree right here. Now just by looking at this pedigree, you need to identify which among these modes of inheritance is shown in the pedigree. First, let's look at autosomal dominant. In autosomal dominant, the trait that is being traced is a dominant trait present on an autosome, which is a non-sex chromosome. The alleles are, the dominant allele is going to be represented by capital R, that is the affected allele, and the small r is the recessive allele or the unaffected allele. The affected individual is either going to have both dominant allele, the homozygous dominant, or one dominant allele, because this one dominant allele is able to suppress the recessive allele. This is heterozygous dominant. In both these cases, the trait is phenotypically expressed. In unaffected individual, you are going to have homozygous recessive. Okay, let's look at an example of pedigree. So you have been given this pedigree. Your job is to identify which type of mode of inheritance is shown here. Now here's a small or simple trick I want you to follow. Earlier, I said that you had something called carriers, and carriers are possible only in recessive trait. Why? I'll tell you later on in the video. But then remember, carriers are possible only in case of recessive trait. So there are altogether 2 types of inheritance, either dominant inheritance or recessive inheritance. Under dominant inheritance, it is either autosomal or X-linked. Under recessive, it is either autosomal or X-linked, right? Now, if carriers are present, you can directly go in this direction. That is, recessive inheritance is present. If carriers are not present, That means dominant inheritance is what's shown here. In this case, are carriers present? No, carriers are not present. That means the type of inheritance is dominant. Now under dominant, again, you have either autosomal, it can either be autosomal or X-linked. You can check for either one of them. Since I just taught you autosomal, let's look at autosomal dominant inheritance. Okay, as I said earlier, right here in autosomal dominant, if a person is affected, the allelic pair or the gene the person has can be R, R or R, R. In this case, the father is affected, but then the mother is not affected. So the mother has to be homozygous recessive. Now, in order to confirm whether or not this is autosomal dominant inheritance, what you need to do is check for offspring whether or not this parent pair, this parent couple can give these offsprings or not. So let's check for it. So we know that 50% genetic information genes come from father and 50% comes from mother. So that's exactly what we are going to do. In first, it's small r, because the child is not affected. So this is not possible. Second case, it's capital R, small r, capital R, small r, small r, small r, capital R, small r. So all offsprings are possible. That means this is your autosomal dominant inheritance. Okay, let's look at few examples. The way to learn examples is Nepal. So M comes before N, so MN. M for Marfan syndrome and NE of Nepal, neurofibromatosis. P for polydactyly, polycystic kidney disease, porphyria variegate. A for achondroplasia, L for lactose intolerance. So these are your autosomal dominant disease. Next, autosomal recessive. Here you have two alleles. Again, capital R, small r. Capital R unaffected because it is dominant. Small r affected because it is recessive. Affected individual. Affective individual contains both small r or homozygous recessive. Unaffected individual contains both capital R or homozygous dominant. Carrier individual contains one capital R and another small r. That is one dominant allele, another recessive allele. This is heterozygous dominant. I said earlier, carriers are seen in recessive traits. In case of affected individual with homozygous recessive, the trait is phenotypically expressed. In case of carrier individual with heterozygous dominant, the trait is not phenotypically expressed, but due to the presence of this small r, the allele can or the gene can be passed down from one generation to another generation. Okay, let's look at this example. So apply the trick whether or not a carrier is present. Since the carrier is present, that means the type of inheritance shown here is recessive, not dominant. Now within recessive, it can either be autosomal or X-linked. Take any one of them. Since I just taught you autosomal, I'm gonna take autosomal and check for it. So let's check for autosomal recessive inheritance. So here are the information for autosomal recessive inheritance that you need to know. Now, within this pedigree, the father is not affected, and under autosomal recessive, for unaffected father, it's capital R, both dominant, homozygous dominant. But then the mother is carrier, capital R, small r. Now you need to check for the offsprings, whether these offsprings are possible from this couple or not. So first, you have a son who is a carrier. So 50% genetic material from father, 50% genetic material from mother. So capital R from father, small r from mother. For carrier female, capital R from father, small r from mother. For unaffected male, capital R from father, capital R from mother. Unaffected female, capital R from father, capital R from mother. For carrier female, capital R from father, capital small r from mother. So yes, the offsprings are possible, and this is your autosomal recessive inheritance. For autosomal recessive, you have sickle cell anemia, albinism, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs disease, phenylketonuria, and Gaucher's disease. In X-linked recessive, the alleles are X with capital R denoting unaffected or dominant, X with small r representing recessive or affected. Affected individual is shown by X small r Y for male and X small r for female. In unaffected individual, you have X capital R Y for male and X capital R for female. In carrier individual, you have X capital R and X small r. So there's one recessive allele and one dominant allele. Due to the presence of recessive allele, this female is a carrier. However, a carrier male is not possible. Because see, a male can either be X capital R Y, and this would be unaffected, or X cap small r Y, and this would be affected. No other conditions are possible. Carrier males are only possible in autosomal recessive. So one trick to identify the type of inheritance in this pedigree is that first check for carrier. Carrier present or absent. Since the carrier is present, that means there is recessive inheritance. Now, it can either be autosomal recessive or X-linked recessive. And I said earlier, in X-linked recessive, carrier males are not possible because the gene is either X capital R Y, which is unaffected, or X small r Y, which is affected. So whether either you have an empty square or a completely shaded square, but not a half shaded square. However, in this pedigree, you can see that there is a male carrier. So it is recessive due to the presence of carrier, and since it has a male carrier, that means it is autosomal. So it is autosomal recessive inheritance. Okay, let's continue with X-linked inheritance. So here, carriers present, yes, that means recessive, autosomal or X-linked. Okay, it can either be autosomal or X-linked. Let's check for X-linked. In case of X-linked recessive, here are the facts you need to know. You have an unaffected male. So the allelic pair he is going to have, or the gene he is going to have, is obviously X capital R Y. This is X-linked recessive. So if a dominant allele is present, that means the person is unaffected. The male is unaffected. Here we have carriers, so X capital R, X small r. Now let's check for offsprings. Is this possible? 50% from male, which is obviously going to be Y, and 50% from female. It's gonna be X small r. Here 50% from male, 50% from female, 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 50%, yeah, that's it. So all offsprings are possible. There you go. Few examples of X-linked recessive. Here you have it. Color blindness, hemophilia, Duchenne muscular dystrophy and Baker's muscular dystrophy, G6PD deficiency, Hunter syndrome. Okay, next up we have X-linked dominant. So the dominant allele is going to be the one that is affected. So X with capital R is affected, X with small r is unaffected. So affected individual is going to have a dominant allele, allele. Unaffected individual is going to have recessive allele. All right, so for affected male, you have X capital R Y. For affected female, you can have either X capital R, which is homozygous dominant, or X capital R, X small r, which is heterozygous dominant. For unaffected individual, you are going to have X small r Y for male and X small r homozygous recessive for female. So Here are the informations for X-linked dominant disease. Let's put them on. This male is affected and affected by X-linked dominant. So he has to be X or Y. The female is not affected. Okay, are the offsprings possible? So 50% from male, 50% from female affected, 50% from male, 50% from female not affected, 50% from male, 50% from female not affected, 50% from male, 50% female affected, 50% from male, 50% for female not affected. There you go. Okay, now the last two types of inheritance, mitochondrial inheritance. See, mitochondrial genes, they are inherited only from mother. So if a mitochondrial gene is present in mother, then it is going to be inherited to all of her offsprings. But if if a certain mitochondrial gene is not present in the mother, then it is not going to be inherited to anyone. The diseases associated to this type of inheritance are Barth syndrome, lactic acidosis, and Leigh syndrome. Y-linked inheritance. Since the gene is present in Y chromosome and the Y chromosome can only be inherited from father to son, so obviously this gene is only going to be inherited from father to son, and the trait is only going to be inherited from father to son. The diseases associated are hypertrichosis. So if father has hypertrichosis, the son is going to have hypertrichosis. Webtose, if father has webtose, son is going to have webtose. Porcupine man, if father has porcupine man, son is going to be a porcupine man. Look at this pedigree right here. In this pedigree, you can see that a mother is transferring her genetic material to all of her offsprings. So if mother is shaded, all of her offsprings are also shaded. Here also the mother is shaded and so are all of her offsprings. Here mother is shaded and so are all of her offsprings. Here the mother is not shaded, so all of her offsprings are not shaded. And I said which type of inheritance is seen when the character or the trait is passed from mother to all of her offsprings. That is mitochondrial inheritance.